There's nothing quite like the pain of losing your mother, especially when you've spent years pushing away everything she believed in. Rick Lanning learned this the hard way when he returned to clean out her house after the funeral. At 46, this successful architect thought he was done with his mother's faith. He found her beloved Virgin Mary statue and threw it in the trash with bitter words. That same night, his house burned down. No one could explain how or why. Now Rick has to live in his mother's old house. Strange things start happening. The statue keeps appearing. Lights flicker. He hears whispers in the dark. Then Rick finds a letter his mother left behind, and everything changes. Some things demand respect, and some mistakes can't be undone. What happens when the thing you throw away comes back to haunt you? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after the fire, Marcus Westfield stood in what used to be his living room, surveying the charred remains of his carefully curated life. 20 years of architectural awards, client photos, and design magazines had been reduced to ash and twisted metal. The insurance adjuster, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, made notes on his clipboard while shaking his head. "I've been doing this for 15 years, Mr. Westfield," he said, tapping his pen against the board. "Never seen anything quite like this. The fire department's report shows no electrical issues, no gas leaks, no obvious accelerants. It's like the house just decided to burn." Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion that had settled over him since his mother's funeral 3 days ago. At 46, he prided himself on solving problems through logic and careful planning. Buildings followed rules. Materials had predictable properties. Fire had causes. This situation violated everything he understood about the physical world. His phone buzzed with another text from his business partner, Jonathan. "Client meeting moved to Thursday. Hope you're holding up okay." Marcus stared at the message, realizing he hadn't even thought about work since throwing his mother's statue in the trash. The memory made him wince. Even in his grief and anger, that had been unnecessarily cruel. The drive to his childhood home took 20 minutes through familiar streets that seemed smaller than he remembered. Oak trees lined the avenue where he'd learned to ride a bicycle, their branches forming a canopy over cracked sidewalks. His mother's house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch she'd painted blue every other summer. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor, waved from her garden as Marcus pulled into the driveway. She'd been his mother's closest friend for 30 years, the kind of woman who brought casseroles during illness and remembered everyone's birthday. Marcus had always found her relentless cheerfulness slightly irritating, but his mother had cherished their daily conversations over the fence. "Marcus, dear," she called, wiping soil from her hands with a kitchen towel. "I'm so sorry about your house. When I saw the smoke in the distance last night, I never imagined. Have you spoken with Father Stevens yet? He's been asking about you." "I'm not really in a talking mood right now," Marcus replied, hefting his overnight bag from the back seat. The truth was, he hadn't spoken to anyone from his mother's church in over a decade. Their well-meaning sympathy felt suffocating, loaded with implications about prayer and God's plan that made his skin crawl. The key turned easily in the front door lock. His mother had always kept the same hiding spot under the ceramic turtle, by the steps, a security habit that had driven Marcus crazy during his teenage years. Now it felt like a small mercy, one less complication in an increasingly complicated situation. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and old wood, exactly as it had during his childhood. His mother's presence lingered in every carefully arranged photograph, every cross-stitched pillow, every religious artifact that decorated the mantels and shelves. The Virgin Mary statue sat in its customary place on the living room mantel, surrounded by votive candles and fresh flowers that Mrs. Patterson must have placed there. Marcus stopped short, staring at the porcelain figure. It was identical to The one he'd thrown away, down to the tiny chip on the base where he'd dropped it as a child. But that was impossible. He'd personally carried that statue to the garbage can behind his house, watched the lid close over it. This had to be a different one, maybe a backup his mother had kept in a closet. He set his bag down and walked closer, examining the figure's serene face. His mother had owned this particular statue for as long as he could remember. A wedding, gift from her own mother. She told him stories about praying to it during his difficult birth, through his father's death when Marcus was 12, during every crisis and celebration of their shared life. Superstitious nonsense, he muttered, but the words felt hollow in the quiet house. The leather-bound prayer journal lay open on the side table, his mother's careful handwriting visible across both pages. Marcus had always been impressed by her penmanship, the way she formed each letter with deliberate care. She'd written in this journal every morning for decades, filling page after page with prayers for family, friends, and strangers she'd never met. Today's entry, dated just a week before her death, caught his attention. Lord, watch over Marcus. His heart has grown hard, but I know you can soften it again. Help him remember the faith we shared when he was small. Show him that love is stronger than anger and that you never give up on your children, even when they give up on you. The A. Words hit him like a physical blow. Even in her final days, she'd been worried about his soul, praying for a reconciliation he'd made clear would never come. Their last conversation had been an argument about his divorce, his drinking, his refusal to attend church even for Christmas. She died believing he was lost. Marcus closed the journal and climbed the stairs to his old bedroom. Nothing had changed. The same baseball trophies lined the windowsill, the same model airplanes hung from fishing line attached to the ceiling. His mother had preserved everything exactly as he'd left it when he moved out for college 28 years ago. He sat on the narrow bed, feeling the familiar squeak of springs that had kept him awake countless nights during adolescence. Through the window he could see Mrs. Patterson's house, where warm light glowed in the kitchen windows. She was probably preparing dinner, maybe baking one of those pies she used to bring over when his mother felt sick. His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Jonathan's name appeared on the screen. "How are you holding up?" his partner asked when Marcus answered. "The house is gone," Marcus said simply. "Insurance will cover most of it, but it'll take months to rebuild. I'm staying at my mother's place for now. Take all the time you need. The Morrison project can wait, and I'll handle the Henderson consultation myself. Focus on what you need to do." After hanging up, Marcus realized he hadn't eaten since breakfast. The refrigerator contained enough food for a week, all carefully labeled containers that Mrs. Patterson had obviously prepared. A note in her rounded handwriting explained heating instructions and storage details. As darkness fell over Maple Street, Marcus found himself standing in the living room again, staring at the Virgin Mary statue. The votive candles flickered in, the evening breeze from an open window casting dancing shadows across the porcelain face. For just a moment, he could almost hear his mother's voice reciting the rosary, the familiar rhythm of prayers that had once brought him comfort. But that was memory, nothing more. Tomorrow he would begin the practical work of rebuilding his life, starting with phone calls to contractors and insurance adjusters. Tonight he would sleep in his childhood bed and try not to think about statues or prayers or the disappointed expression his mother had worn during their final argument. He turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, leaving the Virgin Mary alone in the darkness, surrounded by the lingering scent of lavender and the weight of decades of whispered prayers. The morning brought grey skies and a phone call from Detective Morrison, the fire investigator assigned to Marcus's case. They arranged to meet at the burned house at 10 o'clock, giving Marcus time for coffee and a reluctant conversation with Mrs. Patterson, who had appeared at his door with fresh muffins and concerned questions. "Your mother used to say you inherited your father's stubborn streak," she said, settling into the kitchen chair that had been her unofficial spot during countless visits. "But she also said you had his good heart." buried somewhere underneath. All that pride. Marcus accepted the muffin, but avoided her eyes. Pride didn't burn down my house. No, but it might explain why you're sitting here looking like a man who's lost more than just wood and drywall. She patted his hand with the gentle firmness he remembered from childhood. Your mother never stopped believing in you, you know. Even when you stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped believing in anything she held dear, the words stung because they were true. After his father's death, Marcus had gradually pulled away from everything that reminded him of loss and helplessness. Faith, family traditions, even the simple comfort of belonging somewhere, all of it had felt like vulnerability he couldn't afford. Detective Morrison turned out to be a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many inexplicable things. He met Marcus at the ruins of the house, carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "I'll be straight with you, Mr. Westfield," he said, kicking at a charred piece of siding. "This fire makes no sense. We've ruled out electrical problems, gas leaks, lightning strikes, even arson. The burn pattern suggests the fire started in multiple locations simultaneously, but there's no evidence of accelerants or timing devices." They walked through what used to be the living room, where Marcus's leather furniture had been reduced to springs and ash. The detective pointed to scorch marks on the walls that formed no logical pattern, as if the flames had danced rather than followed normal combustion principles. "The temperature readings were off the charts," Morrison continued. "Hot enough to melt aluminum, but your neighbor's roses 20 feet away didn't even wilt. The fire department's never seen anything like it." Marcus knelt beside the remains of his coffee table, running his fingers through the ash. Something hard and smooth caught his attention. A corner of what used to be the family photograph that sat on his mantel. The picture had been a gift from his mother, taken during a rare, peaceful moment 2 Christmases ago, when they'd managed to avoid arguing about religion or his failed marriage. He brushed away the soot, expecting to find nothing but charred paper. Instead, his mother's face stared back at him, completely intact while everything around her had been destroyed. Her smile was exactly as he remembered, warm and knowing, as if she'd been expecting this moment. "Detective," Marcus called, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Look at this." Morrison examined the photograph with a puzzled frown. "That's impossible. Paper burns at 451 degrees Fahrenheit. This fire reached over 2,000 degrees in some spots." He held the fragment up to the light, turning it in his thick fingers. "It's like someone cut around her face with surgical precision, but the edges are clearly burned." Marcus stared at his mother's preserved image, remembering the last time they'd spoken. She'd called to invite him to Easter service, and he'd declined with the same tired excuses he'd been using for years. Too busy, too much work, maybe next time. Her voice had carried disappointment, but also something else, a certainty that had irritated him then and frightened him now. "Keep it," Morrison said, handing back the photograph. "Maybe it'll bring you some comfort. God knows this whole situation could use some divine intervention." The drive back to Maple Street felt longer than usual. Marcus kept glancing at the photograph on his passenger seat, his mother's face seeming to watch him with that patient expression he remembered from countless childhood disagreements. She'd always known how to wait him out, never pushing too hard, but never giving up entirely. Mrs. Patterson was watering her roses when he pulled into the driveway. She waved, and he forced himself to wave back, though the simple gesture felt exhausting. The house looked different in the afternoon light, older somehow, as if his mother's absence had aged the paint and warped the shutters. Inside, the Virgin Mary statue still occupied its place on the mantel, surrounded by the same votive candles and fresh flowers. Marcus stopped in front of it, studying the serene face that had watched over his childhood prayers and teenage rebellions. His mother had genuinely believed this piece of porcelain could intercede with God on behalf of mortal sinners like her. Stubborn son, "Ridiculous," he said aloud, but his voice lacked conviction. He placed the photograph next to the statue, his mother's face now watching the room from both images. The similarity in their expressions was unsettling. The same patient love, the same quiet confidence, as if they shared a secret Marcus wasn't ready to understand. The afternoon passed slowly. Marcus tried to work, spreading architectural drawings across his mother's dining room table, but concentration proved impossible. Every sound in the old house seemed amplified. The settling of floorboards, the whisper of wind through window screens, the distant tick of the grandfather clock that had marked time in this hallway for 40 years. As evening approached, he found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the Virgin Mary statue through the doorway. The votive candles flickered despite the absence of any breeze, their flames dancing in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. A chill ran down his spine, though the house felt warm. The temperature dropped suddenly, noticeably, as if someone had opened a freezer door. Marcus's breath began to mist, and the candle flames went out all at once, leaving the room in darkness. He fumbled for the light switch, his hands trembling with adrenaline and something deeper, a fear he hadn't felt since childhood nightmares. When the lights came on, the Virgin Mary statue was gone. Marcus blinked hard, certain his eyes were playing tricks, but the mantel stood empty except for the photograph and the extinguished candles. He searched the room frantically, checking behind furniture and under tables, but found nothing. The statue had simply vanished. His phone rang, making him jump. Mrs. Patterson's number appeared on the screen. "Marcus, dear," she said when he answered. "I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to make sure you're all right. I thought I saw your mother standing in the front window just now, and I wanted to—" The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, then at the empty mantel, then at his mother's face in the preserved photograph. For the first time since childhood, he found himself wishing he still knew how to pray. Marcus woke to the sound of his mother's rosary beads clicking together in the darkness. The familiar rhythm, 3 clicks, pause, 3 clicks, pulled him from uneasy dreams of burning houses and disappearing statues. He lay still in his childhood bed, listening to the wooden beads his mother had worn smooth through decades of prayer. The sound stopped as soon as he sat up. Pale morning light filtered through the curtains he'd forgotten to close. The rosary beads lay on the nightstand, where he was certain they hadn't been when he went to sleep. The worn wood felt warm against his palm, as if someone had been holding them recently. Downstairs, the Virgin Mary statue had returned to its place on the mantel. Marcus stood in the doorway, coffee mug trembling in his hands, staring at the porcelain figure that had vanished the night before. It sat exactly where it always had, surrounded by fresh flowers that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. The votive candles glowed with steady flames, as if they'd been burning all night without consuming any wax. His phone rang, interrupting the surreal tableau. Jonathan's name appeared on the screen. "You sound terrible," his partner said after Marcus answered with a hoarse greeting. "I didn't sleep well." The understatement felt absurd. He'd spent most of the night checking locks and turning on lights, jumping at every creak and settling sound the old house made. "Look, I hate to add to your stress, but the Morrison project is running into problems. The client wants changes to the foundation design, and they're threatening to pull out if we can't deliver revised plans by Friday. I know your mind is on other things, but email me the specifications," Marcus said, though the thought of concentrating on blueprints felt impossible. "I'll see what I can do." After hanging up, he tried to focus on work, spreading architectural drawings across the dining room table as he had the day before. But the rosary beads seemed to pulse with warmth in his pocket, and every time he looked up, he caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision. Shadows that shouldn't exist, flickering lights that had no source. The morning visit to the fire department proved equally unsettling. Captain Rodriguez, a pragmatic man with 20 years of firefighting experience, showed Marcus photographs of the burn scene that raised more questions than they answered. "I've never seen anything like this," Rodriguez admitted, pointing to images of the melted aluminum fixtures. "The heat was intense enough to liquefy metal, but look at this." He indicated a wooden fence post 6 feet from the house. "Not even scorched. Whatever burned your house was selective about what it consumed." Marcus studied the photographs, noting the strange patterns the fire had left behind. Windows had melted inward rather than exploding outward, as if the heat had come from inside the glass itself. The garage door had warped into impossible shapes, while the gasoline inside had remained completely untouched. "Any theories?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. Rodriguez shrugged. "My grandmother would have called it the devil's work. But I deal in facts, not folklore. All I can tell you is that this fire violated every law of combustion I know." The drive home took Marcus past the Catholic church, where his mother had worshipped for 40 years. St. Augustine's stood on a hill overlooking the town, its spire visible from most neighborhoods. Marcus had spent countless Sunday mornings in those pews, fidgeting through sermons and daydreaming during prayers, until his father's death had convinced him that God either didn't exist or didn't care about human suffering. On impulse, he pulled into the parking lot. Father Stevens was tending the garden behind the rectory, a thin man in his 60s, with gentle eyes and hands permanently stained with soil. He looked up as Marcus approached, his face brightening with recognition. "Marcus," he said, removing his gardening gloves. "I'm so sorry about your mother. She was one of our most faithful parishioners." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate. "I wanted to ask you about something, hypothetically." Father Stevens gestured toward a bench beneath an oak tree. "Of course. What's troubling you?" Marcus sat down, surprised by how easily the questions came. "If someone were to disrespect a religious object, not intentionally blasphemous, just angry and grieving, would there be consequences?" The priest studied him with knowing eyes. "You mean spiritual consequences?" "I mean any consequences. I'm trying to understand some things that have been happening since my mother died." Father Stevens was quiet for a long moment, watching birds flit between the tree branches. "Your mother used to worry about you, you know. She said you'd inherited your father's logical mind, but lost his sense of wonder. She prayed that someday you'd experience something that couldn't be explained away." A chill ran down Marcus's spine. "What kind of something?" "Grace," she hoped. "But grace often comes disguised as other things: mystery, challenge, even fear. The Virgin Mary is particularly protective of those who show her reverence, and particularly persistent with those who need her intercession most." Marcus pulled the rosary beads from his pocket. "These were my mother's. They keep appearing in strange places." Father Stevens examined the worn wood with reverent fingers. "She carried these every day for 30 years. They absorbed decades of prayer, hope, and love. Objects like this, they remember." "You're talking about supernatural intervention." "I'm talking about love that transcends death," the priest corrected gently. "Your mother's faith was strong enough to move mountains. Don't underestimate what it might accomplish for a son she never stopped praying for." As Marcus drove home, the rosary beads grew warm in his pocket again, pulsing like a heartbeat. The Virgin Mary statue seemed to watch him through the living room window as he pulled into the driveway, its painted eyes following his movement. With impossible awareness, Mrs. Patterson waved from her garden. But when Marcus waved back, she looked confused, as if she hadn't been acknowledging him at all. She'd been talking to someone, or something, that only she could see. That night the phone calls began. Marcus's landline rang every hour on the hour, but when he answered, only silence greeted him. The caller ID showed his own number, which should have been impossible. After the 4th call, he unplugged the phone, but the ringing continued, coming from somewhere deep within the walls themselves. The Virgin Mary statue glowed softly in the darkness, its porcelain face serene and patient, as if it had all the time in the world to wait for Marcus to understand what was happening to him. Father Stevens arrived the next morning with a small glass vial of holy water and an expression of gentle determination. Marcus had called him after a sleepless night punctuated by phantom phone calls and the sound of footsteps in empty rooms. "I brought this for you," the priest said, offering the vial. "It was blessed during last Sunday's service, the same one your mother attended every week for 40 years. Marcus stared at the clear liquid, remembering his mother's reverent collection of religious artifacts. "I'm not sure I believe in this sort of thing." "Belief isn't always required for grace to work," Father Stevens replied. "Sometimes faith follows experience rather than preceding it." Marcus accepted the vial reluctantly, surprised by its weight. Such a small thing shouldn't feel so substantial, but the glass seemed to pulse with warmth against his palm. "What am I supposed to do with it?" "Keep it close. Use it if you feel threatened or afraid. And Marcus," the priest placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, "don't dismiss what you're experiencing just because it challenges your understanding of reality. Your mother believed in things greater than herself. Perhaps it's time you considered the possibility that she was right." After Father Stevens left, Marcus tried to return to his normal routine. He spread architectural plans across the dining room table, determined to complete the Morrison project revisions despite his lack of sleep. But concentration proved impossible when every sound seemed amplified, every shadow appeared to move with purpose. The first voice came at exactly noon. Marcus. Soft, familiar, unmistakably his mother's voice calling from the kitchen. He froze, pencil suspended over the blueprint. The voice came again, patient and loving, exactly as he remembered from childhood when she'd called him for lunch, or help with household chores. "Marcus, come here." He found the kitchen empty, but every cabinet door stood open, revealing neat rows of dishes and glassware that his mother had arranged with careful precision. The Virgin Mary statue sat on the counter, though he was certain it had been on the mantel when he'd passed through 10 minutes earlier. His hands shook as he reached for his phone to call his ex-wife Angela. They'd divorced 3 years ago after 10 years of marriage, a casualty of his workaholic tendencies and growing emotional distance. But she knew him better than anyone, and he desperately needed to talk to someone who wouldn't think he was losing his mind. "Marcus?" Angela's voice carried surprise and concern. "Is everything okay? You never called during the day?" "My house burned." "Down," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm staying at my mother's place and strange things are happening. I think I'm losing my grip on reality." "Slow down. Start from the beginning." He told her everything: the fire, the statues, disappearances, the voices, the phantom phone calls. Angela listened without interruption, a habit that had always calmed him during their marriage's better moments. "Have you been sleeping?" she asked when he finished. "Not much. Eating regularly. Mrs. Patterson keeps bringing food, but I don't have much appetite." Angela was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, you've been through enormous stress. Your mother's death, losing your house, dealing with insurance and investigations. It would be strange if you weren't experiencing some psychological effects. So you think I'm imagining things? I think grief does complicated things to people. Remember when my father died? I heard his voice for weeks, saw him in crowds, felt his presence everywhere. The mind processes loss in mysterious ways." Marcus wanted to believe her explanation, but as they talked, the Virgin Mary statue moved again, gliding silently from the counter to the windowsill without any visible means of propulsion. He watched it happen in broad daylight with perfect clarity, while his ex-wife's rational voice provided comforting theories about stress and grief. "Maybe you should talk to someone," Angela continued. "A therapist or a grief counselor. You don't have to handle this alone." After hanging up, Marcus realized how isolated he'd become. His circle of friends had shrunk over the years, narrowed to work colleagues and casual acquaintances. His mother had been his only family, and he'd spent the last decade pushing her away. Now she was gone, and he was facing something inexplicable with no one to turn to, except a priest and a neighbor who'd probably witnessed more supernatural activity than she'd admitted. The afternoon brought a desperate attempt at normalcy. Marcus drove to the hardware store, determined to purchase sage and other cleansing materials he'd read about online. If his mother's house was experiencing some kind of spiritual disturbance, perhaps modern solutions could address the problem. The teenage clerk behind the counter looked skeptical as Marcus selected white sage, salt, and several packages of new light bulbs. "Having some kind of rodent problem?" the boy asked, noting the salt. "Something like that," Marcus replied. Back at the house, he followed internet instructions for burning sage, walking through each room while waving the smoking bundle and feeling utterly ridiculous. The acrid smoke made his eyes water, but he persisted, focusing on the logical premise that if supernatural forces could create problems, perhaps other supernatural forces could solve them. The ritual seemed to work. The oppressive atmosphere lightened, the cold spots disappeared, and the Virgin Mary statue remained in one location for the rest of the afternoon. Marcus allowed himself a moment of hope, thinking he'd found a solution that bridged the gap between his rational worldview and the inexplicable events he'd witnessed. That hope lasted until midnight. He woke to the sound of his mother's voice singing a lullaby he hadn't heard since childhood. The melody drifted through the walls, soft and loving, exactly as he remembered from nights when fever or nightmares had sent him seeking comfort in his parents' bedroom. But when he crept downstairs to investigate, he found something that stopped his heart. The Virgin Mary statue stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by every religious artifact in the house. Crucifixes, prayer cards, rosary beads, and holy water fonts had been arranged in a perfect circle around the porcelain figure. The votive candles burned with flames that cast no shadows, and the air shimmered with a presence that felt both loving and implacably determined. Marcus clutched the holy water vial Father Stevens had given him, his rational mind finally surrendering to the impossible truth. His mother was trying to tell him something, and she wouldn't stop until he listened. Marcus found his mother's Bible the next morning, lying open on the kitchen table, where he was certain no book had been the night before. The worn leather cover showed decades of use, its pages soft with handling and marked with countless strips of paper that served as bookmarks. This particular passage had been highlighted in yellow ink, with notes written in his mother's careful handwriting along the margins. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Below the verse, his mother had written, "For Marcus, when he's ready to stop carrying the world alone." The words hit him like a physical blow. He remembered this Bible from childhood, how his mother would read from it every morning before making breakfast, her lips moving silently as she absorbed whatever passage had called to her that day. She'd tried to share these moments with him, inviting him to sit beside her at the kitchen table, but he'd always been too busy with homework or too eager to escape to friends' houses where religion didn't permeate every conversation. Now, sitting in that same chair, Marcus realized she'd been preparing for this moment for years. Every highlighted passage, every careful notation, every prayer recorded in her journal, all of it had been building towards something she'd seen coming long. Before he'd understood what was happening, his phone buzzed with a text from Jonathan. "Morrison project deadline moved up. Need those revisions by Wednesday." Marcus stared at the message, realizing he hadn't thought about work in days. The career that had once defined his identity now felt distant and unimportant compared to the supernatural crisis unfolding in his childhood kitchen. He spent the morning reading his mother's Bible, following the trail of bookmarks and annotations she'd left behind. The pattern became clear as he moved from passage to passage. Every marked verse dealt with forgiveness, redemption, or the patient love of a parent for a wayward child. She'd been building a case, accumulating evidence of divine mercy, like a lawyer preparing for the most important trial of her life. One bookmark led to the story of the prodigal son, where she'd written, "Never too late to come home." Another marked a passage about faith, the size of a mustard seed, annotated with, "Marcus has more faith than he knows," buried under hurt and pride. Father Stevens found him there when he arrived for their scheduled appointment, Marcus's head, buried in scripture, while the Virgin Mary statue watched from its place among the circled artifacts. "Your mother had remarkable insight," the priest observed, settling into the chair across from Marcus. "She understood that faith isn't always a destination. Sometimes it's a journey back to something we've lost. She wrote notes about me in almost every chapter," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion he'd been suppressing for days. "It's like she knew this would happen, knew I'd eventually need to read these words." Father Stevens examined the Bible with reverent hands, pausing at passages that had been marked with particular care. "Your mother believed in what we call the long view, the idea that God's timeline extends far beyond our immediate understanding. She planted seeds with every prayer, trusting that they would bloom when the soil of your heart was finally ready. They talked for an hour about Catholic concepts Marcus had forgotten or dismissed. The communion of saints, the power of intercessory prayer, the idea that love could transcend death and manifest in the physical world. Father Stevens explained these doctrines with the patience of someone who'd spent decades helping skeptics wrestle with mysteries that defied rational explanation. "The Church teaches that certain souls are granted special permission to intervene in earthly affairs," the priest said, his eyes on the Virgin Mary statue, "usually for the salvation of family members who've strayed from the path. Your mother's faith was strong enough to move mountains, Marcus. Don't underestimate what it might accomplish for a son she never stopped loving." After Father Stevens left, Marcus attempted to return to work, but the architectural drawings seemed meaningless compared to the theological blueprints his mother had left behind. He called Jonathan to explain that he needed more time. That family. Matters were proving more complicated than expected. "Take care of yourself," his partner said, though Marcus could hear the frustration beneath the concern. "The business will survive, but don't disappear on me completely." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Patterson knocked on the front door, carrying a covered dish and wearing an expression of maternal determination that reminded Marcus painfully of his mother. "You look terrible," she announced, pushing past him into the kitchen. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" She bustled around the familiar space, heating soup and cutting bread, while maintaining a steady stream of conversation about neighbors, weather, and the garden club meeting she'd missed to check on him. But her cheerful chatter couldn't hide the worried glances she kept shooting at the Virgin Mary statue and the religious artifacts that still surrounded it. "Your mother used to say that some prayers take longer to answer than others," Mrs. Patterson said, ladling soup into a bowl. "She said the biggest requests required the most patience, like asking God to soften a hardened heart." Marcus accepted the soup, but found it difficult to swallow. "Did she talk about me much?" "Every day," Mrs. Patterson replied gently. "She worried that you'd inherited your father's stubbornness without his surrender. Your father fought his faith for years after you were born, but he eventually made peace with mystery. Your mother hoped you'd follow the same path." "What changed his mind?" Mrs. Patterson smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "You did. The night you were born, the doctor said you might not survive. Your father spent 12 hours in the hospital chapel, bargaining with God like Jacob wrestling the angel. When you pulled through, he never questioned divine intervention again." As evening approached, Marcus found himself standing before the Virgin Mary statue, studying the serene face that had watched over his childhood prayers. The porcelain features seemed more lifelike than he remembered, as if consciousness flickered behind the painted eyes. "I don't know what you want from me," he said aloud, feeling foolish but desperate. "If you're really there, if any of this is real, then show me what I'm supposed to do." The statue remained motionless, but the votive candles flared suddenly, their flames reaching toward the ceiling before settling back to normal height. The holy water vial in Marcus's pocket grew warm, pulsing like a heartbeat, and for just a moment he could swear he heard his mother's voice whispering the rosary, prayers that had once lulled him to sleep. The discovery came at 3 in the morning, when Marcus finally gave up on sleep and decided to organize his mother's personal papers. The death certificate lay buried beneath insurance documents and medical bills, an official piece of paper he'd signed without really reading during the overwhelming hours after her funeral. Now, by the light of his mother's desk lamp, the timestamp caught his attention with the force of a physical blow. Margaret Catherine Westfield. Time of death, 11:47 p.m. Marcus stared at the precise notation, his hands beginning to tremble as the implications sank in. He pulled out his phone and scrolled back through his call log until he found the exact moment he'd thrown his mother's Virgin Mary statue into the trash can behind his house. 47 p.m. The same minute. The same exact minute his mother had died, he'd been committing what Father Stevens would call an act of sacrilege against her most cherished possession. While she drew her last breath in a hospital bed, he'd been hurling her sacred statue into garbage with bitter words about superstition and foolishness. The synchronicity felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He'd never believed in divine timing or supernatural intervention, but this coincidence stretched the boundaries of statistical probability beyond any rational explanation. Either he was experiencing the cruelest twist of fate imaginable, or something far more intentional was unfolding around him. Marcus stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face, studying his reflection in the mirror his mother had hung there 40 years ago. He looked haggard, hollow-eyed, like a man wrestling with forces beyond his comprehension. The holy water vial in his pajama pocket pulsed with warmth, a reminder of Father Stephen's words about grace disguised as mystery and challenge. When he returned to the living room, every light in the house was blazing, though he distinctly remembered leaving most of them off. The Virgin Mary statue stood in the center of the religious artifact circle, but now it seemed to glow with an inner radiance that had nothing to do with reflected candlelight. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in the span of seconds. Marcus's breath began to mist, and frost appeared on the windows despite the warm September night outside. The floorboards creaked with the sound of footsteps, though no visible presence moved through the room. Then he saw her, not clearly, not in the way he'd see a living person, but as a suggestion of movement in his peripheral vision. The familiar shape of his mother's slight frame, the way she'd held her shoulders when she was determined about something important. She appeared and disappeared like heat shimmer there, one moment and gone the next, but her presence filled the room with the same patient love he remembered from childhood. "Mom." The word escaped him before he could stop it, barely above a whisper. The apparition turned toward him, and for just an instant Marcus saw her face, worn by illness but radiant with purpose, her eyes holding the same gentle disappointment she'd carried during their final argument. She pointed toward the Virgin Mary statue, then toward the Bible lying open on the kitchen table, her gestures clear and urgent. Then she was gone, leaving only the scent of lavender and the conviction that he was running out of time to understand what she needed from him. Marcus called Mrs. Patterson despite the early hour, knowing she'd been his mother's confidant for 3 decades and might have answers to questions he was only beginning to formulate. "I saw her," he said when the elderly woman answered with surprising alertness. "My mother. She was here in the living room trying to tell me something." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment. "I've been seeing her too," she admitted finally. "In the garden, by the fence where we used to talk every morning. She looks worried, Marcus, like she's running out of time to fix something important. The timing of her death, it matches exactly when I threw away her statue, to the minute. Oh, my dear boy." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried a weight of understanding that made Marcus's chest tighten. "Your mother always said the worst pain a parent could experience was dying with a child's soul in danger. She must have felt your act of rejection at The very moment she was preparing to meet God. The words hit him like stones. Marcus sank into his mother's favorite chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd done. While she'd been fighting for her life in a sterile hospital room, he'd been desecrating everything she held sacred, unknowingly compounding her suffering in her final moments. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How do I fix this?" "Start by apologizing," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "Really apologizing, not just going through the motions. Your mother can hear you, Marcus. She's been waiting 46 years for you to come home to the faith she never stopped nurturing." Marcus spent the rest of the night reading his mother's Bible, following the trail of highlighted passages that chronicled her decades-long prayer campaign for his salvation. Every marked verse built upon the previous one, creating a theological argument for redemption that she'd constructed with the patience of someone who understood that God's timeline operated differently than human expectations. The final bookmark led to a passage in Jeremiah, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future." Beside it, his mother had written her last note, "Marcus will understand when he's ready. Love is patient." As dawn broke over Maple Street, Marcus knelt in front of the Virgin Mary statue for the first time since childhood. The posture felt awkward, after decades of standing straight and proud, but the humility was necessary. He was finally ready to acknowledge that some mysteries couldn't be solved through architectural precision or logical analysis. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the porcelain face that had watched over his childhood. "I'm sorry for throwing you away, for mocking what Mom held sacred, for being too proud to understand what really mattered to her." The statue remained motionless, but the votive candles flickered in response, their flames dancing with renewed vigor. The holy water vial grew warm against his chest, and for the first time in days, Marcus felt something that might have been peace settling over his exhausted spirit. But even as he knelt there, seeking forgiveness for sins, he was only beginning to understand. Marcus sensed that this was just the beginning. His mother's spirit had appeared for a reason, and her patient presence suggested that his journey toward redemption had only just begun. The timing of her death had been no coincidence. It had been a moment of divine synchronicity that would require much more than a simple apology to fully comprehend and resolve. The hidden compartment revealed itself by accident when Marcus knocked over his mother's desk lamp while organizing her papers. The heavy brass base struck the wooden desk with enough force to jar loose a panel he'd never noticed, revealing a secret space his mother had kept hidden for decades. Inside lay a single envelope, sealed with red wax and marked with his name in his mother's careful handwriting. The paper felt heavy and expensive, the kind used for important documents rather than casual correspondence. Marcus's hands trembled as he broke the seal, somehow knowing that whatever lay inside would change everything he thought he understood about his mother, his family, and the supernatural events that had been unfolding around him. The letter was dated 3 months before his mother's death, written during one of her hospital stays, when doctors had first mentioned the possibility that her treatments might not be successful. Her handwriting remained steady and clear despite her illness, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood she might not have another opportunity to say what needed to be said. "My dearest Marcus," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the events I have foreseen are finally coming to pass. I hope you will forgive an old woman for the steps I have taken to secure your salvation. But a mother's love knows no boundaries, especially when her child's eternal soul hangs in the balance." Marcus sank into his mother's chair, the letter heavy in his hands. The formal tone was unlike anything he'd ever heard from her, suggesting a gravity he was only beginning to comprehend. "There are things about our family that I've never told you, secrets I kept to protect you from burdens no child should carry. But you are a man now, and these truths can no longer remain hidden if you are to understand what is happening to you. The next paragraph made Marcus's heart stop. You had a twin brother, Marcus. His name was Michael, and he lived for only 3 hours after your birth. The doctors said his heart wasn't strong enough to sustain life, but I knew the truth. God had taken one son to save the other. You nearly died that night too, and I made a bargain with heaven that I have spent 46 years fulfilling. Marcus read the words 3 times before their meaning penetrated. A twin brother, dead at birth. His mother had never mentioned another child, never given any indication that his birth had been anything other than a joyful arrival of a healthy baby. I promised the Virgin Mary that if she would save you, I would dedicate my life to bringing you back to faith. Every prayer I have said, every mass I've attended, every sacrifice I've made, all of it has been for your soul, Marcus. Michael is with God, but you have been lost to us for so long. The letter continued, revealing details that rewrote everything Marcus thought he knew about his childhood. His father's sudden embrace of faith after years of skepticism hadn't been triggered by Marcus's birth. It had been his response to losing one son and nearly losing another. The religious artifacts that filled their house hadn't been his mother's personal preference. They had been armor against spiritual forces she'd believed were trying to claim her surviving child. I have seen what is coming for you, my son. In dreams and visions, the Virgin Mary has shown me the path your life will take. You will reject faith as I knew you would. You will build walls around your heart to protect yourself from loss and disappointment. And when I die, you will be so angry and hurt that you will commit an act of sacrilege against the very thing I have prayed to for your salvation. Marcus's hands began to shake violently. His mother had foreseen his destruction of the statue, had known months in advance that he would throw it away in a moment of bitter grief. But she has also shown me what will follow. Your house will burn, not as punishment, but as a sign. You will be forced to return to this place where faith still lives, where every object and memory will work together to soften the heart you have spent decades hardening. The supernatural events you're experiencing are not random, Marcus. They are the fulfillment of a promise I made before you could walk or talk. The letter explained everything, the perfectly timed coincidences, the statue's mysterious returns, his mother's apparition, even the preservation of her face in the burned photograph. All of it had been orchestrated by a force beyond human understanding, set in motion by a mother's desperate bargain to save her surviving child's soul. I arranged for this intervention from beyond because I knew you would never listen to earthly arguments. Your logical mind requires evidence, and so evidence has been provided. The Virgin Mary herself has granted me permission to reach across the veil of death to guide you home. Marcus set the letter down, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his mother had revealed. She hadn't just been praying for his conversion, she had been actively collaborating with supernatural forces to ensure it would happen. Every strange event of the past week had been carefully planned, part of an elaborate spiritual campaign that had been years in the making. The final paragraph brought tears to his eyes. I know this seems manipulative, and perhaps it is, but love sometimes requires desperate measures, especially when eternal consequences are at stake. Your brother Michael is waiting for you in heaven, Marcus, but he cannot greet you there unless you first find your way back to the faith that will reunite our family forever. I have done everything in my power to show you the path. The rest must be your choice. The letter was signed with the same careful handwriting that had marked Bible passages and written prayer intentions for decades. Your loving mother, who will never stop fighting for your soul. Marcus sat in the growing darkness, holding the letter that explained everything and changed everything. His mother hadn't simply died and left him to figure out spiritual matters on his own. She had orchestrated an elaborate supernatural intervention designed to break through the walls of skepticism he'd spent decades constructing. The Virgin Mary statue glowed softly in the candlelight, no longer seeming like a simple piece of porcelain, but rather like a conduit for forces that operated according to rules he was only beginning to understand. His mother's love had literally reached beyond death to save him, and now he finally understood what was being asked of him. The choice was his: continue fighting against mysteries he couldn't explain, or surrender to the possibility that love really could transcend death and work miracles in the lives of those who opened their hearts to receive them. Marcus spent the night processing revelations that shattered every assumption he'd held about his life, his family, and the nature of reality itself. The letter lay on the kitchen table beside his mother's Bible, two artifacts that together painted a picture of spiritual warfare he'd never imagined was being fought on his behalf. Sleep proved impossible as his mind raced through the implications of what his mother had revealed. A twin brother he'd never known, a supernatural bargain struck before his birth, and a divine intervention that had been decades in the making. By dawn, he knew what he had to do. Father Stevens arrived within an hour of Marcus's phone call, carrying a small leather case that contained the tools necessary for what the Catholic Church called formal reconciliation. The priest's eyes showed no surprise when Marcus explained about the letter, the twin brother, and his mother's supernatural bargain. "Your mother spoke to me about this years ago," Father Stevens admitted, settling into the familiar kitchen chair, where he'd shared countless conversations with Margaret Westfield over the decades. She was very specific about what would be required when the time came. She said you would need more than casual confession. You would need the full ritual of spiritual reparation, the kind reserved for souls that have wandered so far from grace that extraordinary measures become necessary. From his case, Father Stevens withdrew items Marcus recognized from his childhood, but had forgotten the significance of blessed candles made from pure beeswax and sanctified during the cathedral's Easter vigil, holy oil that had been consecrated by the bishop himself, a silver crucifix that had belonged to the church for over a century and had been present at countless moments of spiritual transformation. Each object seemed to pulse with accumulated prayer and devotion, as if decades of faithful use had imbued them with supernatural power. "This belonged to your mother," the priest said, lifting a silver crucifix from the case with reverent hands. "She wore it every day for 40 years, through every joy and sorrow, every prayer and sacrifice. She asked me to keep it until you were ready to carry the weight of what it represents, the full burden and blessing of authentic faith." Marcus accepted the crucifix with trembling hands, noting how the silver felt warm, as if it retained the heat of his mother's skin, and the weight seemed disproportionate to its size. When he fastened the chain around his neck, he felt an immediate sense of protection, as if invisible armor had settled over his shoulders, shielding him from forces he was only beginning to understand. "The process will be intense," Father Stevens warned, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who'd guided others through similar spiritual crises. "Genuine spiritual transformation always is. You'll be asked to confront not just the surface sins, the anger, the pride, the rejection of faith, but the deeper wounds that created them. The childhood trauma, the disappointment with God, the fear that surrender means vulnerability. Are you prepared for that level of honesty?" Marcus thought of his brother Michael, the twin he'd never known existed, waiting somewhere beyond death, for a reunion that depended on choices Marcus made in this world. "I'm ready. I think I've been running from this moment my entire adult life." The supernatural activity intensified as the day progressed, as if spiritual forces on both sides of the divine divide were gathering for a final confrontation. The Virgin Mary statue moved constantly now, appearing in different rooms at impossible speeds, surrounded by arrangements of religious artifacts that seemed to shift and change when Marcus wasn't directly observing them. The holy water vial pulsed like a heartbeat, growing warm whenever he approached areas where the spiritual presence felt strongest, and the rosary beads in his pocket clicked together with their own rhythm, as if invisible hands were working. Through decades of accumulated prayers, Mrs. Patterson arrived with lunch and news that made Marcus's chest tighten with emotion. He thought he'd lost the capacity to feel. "I called your daughter," she announced, unpacking sandwiches with the efficiency of someone who'd been feeding people through crises for decades. "She's driving up from the city, should arrive this evening." Marcus stared at her in shock, his heart racing with a mixture of joy and terror. "You called Lily? How did you even get her number?" "Your mother gave it to me months ago, along with specific instructions about when to use it. Said there might come a time when family needed to gather quickly, when the spiritual battle she'd been fighting would require all available love to reach its proper conclusion." Mrs. Patterson's eyes sparkled with the same knowing look his mother had worn when she'd been planning something important. "That girl loves you more than you realize, Marcus. She's been waiting for you to find your way back to the man your mother always knew you could be." The thought of seeing his daughter filled Marcus with equal measures of anticipation and dread. Lily was 22, a college graduate working in environmental law with her mother's fierce intelligence and her grandfather's stubborn streak. She'd grown up watching Marcus reject everything his mother held sacred, and their relationship had suffered accordingly. What would she think of the supernatural events, the spiritual transformation he was attempting? Would she see it as genuine conversion or psychological breakdown brought on by grief and stress? Jonathan arrived unexpectedly in the afternoon, his usually calm demeanor showing cracks of genuine concern as he surveyed the religious artifacts that now dominated every room of the house. "I've been trying to reach you for days," his business partner said, settling uncomfortably into the living room, despite the obvious discomfort the supernatural atmosphere caused him. "The Morrison project fell through when we couldn't deliver the revisions. The Henderson consultation was a disaster without you there, and our biggest client is threatening to find another firm. Marcus, I'm worried about you. This isn't like you." Marcus listened to the recitation of professional disasters that would have sent him into panic just a week ago. Now they seemed distant and unimportant compared to the spiritual crisis he was navigating, like reports from a foreign country he no longer had any desire to visit. "I know this sounds impossible to understand," Marcus said carefully, watching Jonathan's expression as lights flickered around them without any electrical explanation. "But I'm dealing with something more important than business right now. Something that involves my mother, my family, my entire understanding of what's real and what's possible in this universe." Jonathan studied the Virgin Mary statue, noting how it seemed to glow with inner light despite the afternoon sunshine streaming through the windows. He observed the arranged candles, the Bible lying open to marked passages, the rosary beads that occasionally moved on their own. "You're having some kind of religious experience." "I'm having some kind of experience that happens to involve religion," Marcus corrected. "Whether you call it psychological, spiritual, or supernatural doesn't change the fact that it's real and it's happening to me. I can't ignore it. I can't rationalize it away, and I can't go back to pretending that the material world is all there." They talked for an hour, Jonathan growing increasingly uncomfortable as the temperature fluctuated wildly around them and cold spots appeared in corners where no drafts could explain them. When he finally left, promising to hold the business together for another week, Marcus realized he'd just made a choice that would have been unthinkable 7 days earlier. He'd chosen eternal concerns over temporal ones, spiritual transformation, over professional security. As evening approached, the house filled with an energy that made the air itself seem alive with purpose and anticipation. Every religious artifact glowed with soft radiance that had nothing to do with reflected light. The temperature fluctuated between summer heat and winter cold with no discernible pattern, and Marcus could hear whispers in languages he didn't recognize. but somehow understood on a level deeper than translation. Prayers, supplications, and expressions of love that transcended the barriers between worlds. His mother's presence grew stronger as darkness fell, no longer just glimpses in peripheral vision, but a tangible awareness that filled every room with the scent of lavender and the weight of decades of patient love. She was preparing for something, gathering spiritual forces for a confrontation that would determine not just Marcus's fate, but the fulfillment of promises made before his birth, bargains struck in desperate moments when a mother's love faced the possibility of eternal separation from her child. When Lily's car pulled into the driveway, Marcus felt his heart constrict with emotions he'd been suppressing for years. Pride in the strong woman she'd become, regret for the father he'd failed to be, hope that redemption might be possible even for relationships he'd thought were irreparably damaged. Through the window, he watched his daughter climb the porch steps where he'd played as a child, where his mother had waited for him to come home from school, where 3 generations of his family had crossed the threshold between the ordinary, a world and the sacred space that lay beyond. The silver crucifix grew warm against his chest as Lily knocked on the door, and Marcus knew that everything he'd learned, everything he'd experienced, and everything he'd been asked to believe was about to be tested in the crucible of love that existed between a father and the daughter he'd failed to protect from his own spiritual emptiness. Father Stevens returned at sunset, carrying 7 white candles that had been blessed during the cathedral's most sacred ceremonies, each one representing a spiritual gift that would be necessary for the supernatural confrontation ahead. The candles felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with their own inner light, as if the prayers that had sanctified them continued to burn within the wax itself. Wisdom, understanding, counsel, fortitude, knowledge, piety, and fear of the Lord, the priest intoned as he placed each candle in its designated position throughout the living room, according to his mother's detailed instructions from the letter. Your mother was very specific about their placement. She said the spiritual forces trying to reach you would need every available conduit, every possible channel through which divine grace could flow into this world. Lily stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined as she absorbed the supernatural atmosphere that had transformed her grandmother's familiar living room into something that resembled a sacred chapel. She'd arrived an hour earlier, accepting the extraordinary explanation with the same logical approach she applied to environmental law cases, examining evidence, considering possibilities, reaching conclusions based on observable phenomena rather than preconceived notions about what was or wasn't possible. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was witnessing, "whatever's happening here, whatever you need to do, I want to help. Grandma always said family was stronger together than apart." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes at his daughter's words. Her support meant more than she could possibly understand, especially given the years of distance he'd created between them through his rejection of everything her grandmother had tried to teach. "This might get intense," he warned, remembering Father Stevens's explanation of what genuine spiritual transformation required. "I don't know what's going to happen when we begin, but it could be frightening. Grandma appeared to me in a dream last night," Lily replied, her voice carrying the same calm certainty that had characterized her grandmother's approach to supernatural matters. "She told me you were finally ready to come home, but that you'd need family present for the final step. She said some journeys are too important to take alone, especially when they involve crossing bridges between this world and the next." The revelation that his mother had reached across death to communicate with Lily shouldn't have surprised Marcus, given everything else he'd experienced. But it still sent chills through his entire body. The supernatural intervention was expanding beyond him to include the next generation, ensuring that the spiritual victory his mother sought would have lasting impact. Father Stevens began the ritual with prayers Marcus recognized from childhood, but hadn't heard in decades. The Latin words seemed to awaken something dormant in the house itself, The walls hummed with accumulated energy from 40 years of daily prayers. The floorboards creaked with the sound of invisible footsteps as spiritual presences gathered. And the temperature began fluctuating between extremes that defied any natural explanation. As the priest's voice rose in formal supplication to divine powers, the blessed candles burst into flame without any visible ignition source. Their light wasn't ordinary. It pulsed and danced with spiritual energy that seemed to push back against shadows that moved independently of any light source, creating an atmosphere that felt both protective and charged with supernatural potential. "Marcus," Father Stevens said, his voice taking on the formal tone of ecclesiastical authority that connected him to centuries of priestly tradition, "you must confront the darkness you've carried for 20 years, not just the surface anger and pride that everyone can see, but the deeper wound, the fundamental fear that God abandoned you when your father died, that faith is just another word for disappointment." The words hit like a physical blow, dredging up memories Marcus had buried so deeply he'd forgotten they existed. Suddenly, he was 12 again, kneeling beside his father's hospital bed while his mother prayed desperately to the same Virgin Mary statue that now watched from the mantel. He'd believed then, with the absolute faith of childhood, that prayer could heal any illness, that God would never take away the most important person in his world, that the universe operated according to principles of justice and mercy that protected good people from senseless tragedy. When his father died anyway, Marcus had felt more than grief. He'd felt betrayed by a cosmic order that promised meaning but delivered only chaos, by a God who claimed to love his children but allowed them to suffer in ways that served no apparent purpose. "I prayed so hard," Marcus whispered, the confession torn from some deep place in his chest where he'd locked away 34 years of accumulated disappointment. "I believed so completely that faith could move mountains, that love was stronger than death, that good people were protected from random cruelty, and it didn't matter. He died anyway, and I was left with a mother who kept insisting that God had a plan, even when the plan seemed to involve maximum suffering for minimum purpose." The room shook with spiritual energy as Marcus finally spoke the words he'd been carrying since childhood. Books fell from shelves, windows rattled in their frames, and the Virgin Mary statue began to glow with inner light that had nothing to do with reflected candle flames. The blessed candles flared higher, their flames reaching toward the ceiling as if drawn by forces beyond normal combustion. "That's when you closed your heart," Father Stevens said gently, his voice cutting through the supernatural chaos with pastoral understanding. "That's when you decided faith was weakness disguised as virtue, prayer was wishful thinking disguised as wisdom, and love was just another word for eventual loss that smart people learned to avoid." The supernatural manifestations intensified as Marcus's buried pain rose to the surface, like poison being drawn from an infected wound. The air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of decades of suppressed emotion, and through it all, the Virgin Mary statue remained serene and patient, as if she'd been waiting 34 years for this exact moment of truth. Lily moved closer to her father, taking his trembling hand in hers with the same gentle strength her grandmother had always shown during family crises. "Grandma never stopped believing you'd find your way back," she said, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "She told me in the dream that sometimes the strongest faith comes from those who've wrestled with doubt and won, who've stared into the abyss of meaninglessness and chosen to believe in love anyway." Marcus looked at his daughter, this remarkable young woman who'd inherited her grandmother's gentle strength and her grandfather's analytical mind, and realized she represented everything he'd been afraid to hope for. She was living proof that love could survive his failures, that family bonds could endure even when faith faltered, that the next generation could learn from his mistakes without being permanently damaged by them. The blessed candles suddenly went out all at once, plunging the room into darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. But the Virgin Mary statue continued to glow with supernatural radiance that grew stronger rather than dimmer, casting dancing shadows that began to take recognizable shapes. His mother's slight frame, his father's broad shoulders, and a third presence he somehow knew without explanation was his brother Michael. "They're all here," Lily whispered, her voice filled with wonder and recognition. "Can you see them, Dad? Can you see your family?" Marcus could. Not clearly, not in the way he'd see living people, but as shimmering outlines that pulsed with love and anticipation, as presences so real he could almost reach out and touch them. His family had gathered for this moment, spanning the divide between life and death to witness his choice between surrender and continued resistance, between the isolation he'd perfected and the communion he'd rejected. The silver crucifix around. His neck grew hot against his skin, and Marcus realized the time for preparation had ended. Whatever spiritual battle his mother had been fighting on his behalf for 46 years was reaching its climax, and he was finally ready to choose which side he would fight on. The decision would determine not just his own eternal fate, but whether the supernatural intervention his mother had orchestrated would achieve its ultimate purpose. "I'm ready," he said aloud, his voice carrying to every corner of the house and perhaps beyond, reaching realms where his words could be heard by those who'd been waiting decades for this declaration. "I'm ready to believe, ready to surrender, ready to come home." The moment Marcus spoke those words, "I'm ready to believe, ready to surrender, ready to come home," the Virgin Mary statue blazed with light so brilliant it should have been blinding, but somehow wasn't. Instead, the radiance felt warm and welcoming, like sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, and the porcelain figure seemed to come alive without actually moving, radiating a presence so powerful that the very air around it shimmered. With divine energy, Marcus fell to his knees, not from the weight of supernatural pressure, but from the overwhelming realization of how much love had been working behind the scenes of his life for decades. Every stubborn moment, every angry rejection, every prideful dismissal of his mother's faith, all of it had been met with patient persistence and unconditional grace that never gave up, never stopped believing in the possibility of redemption. "Forgive me," he whispered, the words pouring from his heart without conscious thought or theological preparation, "for throwing away what you held sacred, for mocking what you treasured most, for being so proud and angry that I couldn't see the love behind everything you did. Forgive me for wasting so many years, for hurting Mom with my rejection, for choosing isolation over the communion you were offering." The glowing statue pulsed brighter with each word of genuine repentance, and suddenly Marcus could see his mother. Clearly, not as a ghostly apparition or peripheral vision, but as a radiant presence filled with joy and relief, so profound it seemed to illuminate the entire room. She stood beside the Virgin Mary figure, her face transformed by happiness he hadn't seen since before his father's death, her eyes bright with tears of joy that transcended physical form. "My son," her voice came not as sound, but as direct understanding, bypassing his ears to speak straight to his heart in the way only a mother's love could communicate. "I have been waiting so long for you to come home. Every prayer, every mass, every moment of worry and hope, all of it was for this moment." Beside her, another figure materialized with increasing clarity, his father, looking exactly as Marcus remembered from childhood but somehow perfected, his face bearing none of the pain and weariness that illness had carved there in his final months. He wore an expression of pride and welcome that made Marcus's chest ache with longing for conversations they'd never had, for the man-to-man relationship that death had cut short. "You found your way back," his father's presence conveyed with the same wordless communication his mother had used. I knew you would. It just took longer than we hoped. But love is patient, son. Love is always patient." And between them stood a third presence that made Marcus gasp with recognition. A young man with his own face, but eyes that held eternal peace. Features that were simultaneously familiar and strange. This was Michael, the twin brother who had lived only hours, but had been watching over Marcus's spiritual journey for 46 years, waiting for the reunion that could only happen when both brothers shared the same faith. "Michael," Marcus breathed, understanding without explanation that this was the missing piece of his family, the child who had died so that Marcus might live, whose sacrifice had been the foundation for every prayer his mother had offered on his behalf. The blessed candles reignited spontaneously around the room, their flames joining the supernatural radiance that filled every corner with light that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Lily gasped beside him as the spiritual presences became visible to her as well, her face glowing with wonder at seeing the grandmother she'd lost, and the grandfather and uncle she'd never known, but who had been part of her family's story all along. "Grandma," Lily whispered, reaching out toward the luminous figure of her grandmother. "You kept your promise. You brought him home." Father Stevens continued the prayers of reconciliation, but his words seemed distant compared to the direct communication flowing between Marcus and his family. Love washed over him in waves, his mother's fierce protectiveness that had transcended death, his father's steady support that had never wavered even from beyond the grave, and Michael's joy at finally meeting the brother he'd been watching, over from the eternal realm, where time operated differently. "The Virgin Mary has been our advocate," his mother's presence conveyed with the clarity of absolute truth. "She carried every prayer I offered for your soul, amplified every plea for your salvation, and finally convinced heaven to grant this extraordinary intervention. Your rejection of her statue was seen not as blasphemy, but as the desperate act of a wounded heart that needed healing more than punishment." Marcus understood now that his act of throwing away the statue hadn't been the end of something. It had been the beginning of the most important chapter of his spiritual life. The supernatural events, the mysterious fire that had destroyed his house, even his forced return to this place of childhood faith, had all been orchestrated not as punishment, but as rescue operation mounted by love that refused to accept defeat. The Virgin Mary statue began to change before their eyes, transformation occurring at a rate that defied natural processes. Cracks that had existed since Marcus's childhood disappeared as if time itself was reversing. The small chip on the base, where he'd dropped it as a boy, vanished completely, and the faded paint brightened to original colors that seemed to glow with inner light. The entire figure was being restored to perfect condition by divine power that operated according to laws beyond human understanding. "This is grace," Father Stevens said, his voice filled with awe as he witnessed the miraculous restoration taking place before his eyes. "This is what happens when love refuses to give up, when faith persists despite all evidence to the contrary, when a mother's prayers literally move heaven to intervene in earthly affairs." Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. Not just forgiveness, but actual healing of wounds he'd carried since childhood. The anger that had sustained him for decades dissolved like snow in sunlight, replaced by peace he hadn't felt since before his father's death. The walls he'd built around his heart to protect himself from further disappointment crumbled completely, and in their place grew something he'd thought he'd lost forever: hope for meaning, purpose, and connection that extended beyond the material world. The supernatural presences began to communicate not just with Marcus, but with each other, and he realized he was witnessing a family reunion that had been 46 years in the making. His mother's joy at seeing her son's spiritual transformation, his father's pride in Marcus's courage to face truth, and Michael's completion at finally being acknowledged as part of the family story, all of it wove together into a tapestry of love that stretched across the boundary between life and death. "Thank you," Marcus said aloud, speaking to the statue, to his family, to the divine force that had orchestrated this impossible reunion. "Thank you for never giving up on me, for seeing something worth saving even when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for loving me enough to stage an intervention that spans the boundary between worlds." The supernatural presences began to fade, but not with sadness, with completion and satisfaction. Their mission had been accomplished, their prayers answered, their love vindicated. His mother's final look conveyed pure joy mixed with peaceful release. His father nodded with approval and pride, and Michael smiled with the serene expression of someone whose long wait had finally ended in perfect fulfillment. As the brilliant light slowly dimmed to the gentle glow of normal candlelight, Marcus remained on his knees, fundamentally transformed. The Virgin Mary statue sat on the mantel exactly as it always had, but now Marcus saw it for what it truly was. Not a piece of porcelain, but a conduit for love that transcended death, a symbol of intercession that had literally saved his soul. Through the persistence of a mother who refused to accept his spiritual defeat. The spiritual battle his mother had been fighting for 46 years was finally over, and love had achieved the victory that only love could win. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the kitchen of his mother's house, his house now, preparing Sunday dinner for a gathering that would have made her heart sing with joy. The transformation of both the space and his life had been gradual but profound, each day bringing new evidence that the night of supernatural intervention had fundamentally altered not just his beliefs, but his entire approach to living in the world. The Virgin Mary statue occupied its place of honor on the mantel, surrounded by fresh flowers that Lily brought every week and votive candles that Marcus lit each morning with prayers that came as naturally as breathing. The restored porcelain figure seemed to glow with inner light even in daylight, a constant reminder of the miraculous events that had changed everything he thought he knew about faith, family, and the persistence of love beyond death. The house itself had become something more than a residence. It was now a sanctuary where the ordinary and sacred intersected daily. Marcus had kept every religious artifact exactly where his mother had placed them, but now he understood their significance in ways that went far beyond sentimental attachment. Each cross, each prayer card, each blessed object carried the accumulated power of decades of faithful use, creating an atmosphere where spiritual encounters felt not just possible, but natural. Mrs. Patterson bustled through the front door, without knocking, a habit that had developed over the months since Marcus had begun treating her like the grandmother Lily had never had chance to know properly. She carried a covered dish and wore the satisfied expression of someone who'd watched a difficult puzzle finally come together after years of patient waiting. "Father Stevens called," she announced, setting her contribution on the counter beside. Marcus's increasingly successful attempts at recreating his mother's recipe for Sunday roast. "He'll be here at 2, and he's bringing that young couple from the parish who've been struggling with infertility for 3 years. He thought your story might encourage them to keep believing in miracles." Marcus nodded, no longer surprised by the steady stream of visitors who found their way to Maple Street seeking evidence that God still worked wonders in the modern world. Word had somehow spread through the Catholic community about the architect who'd experienced miraculous intervention, and Father Stevens had begun referring people who needed proof that divine love could break through even the most stubborn spiritual resistance. The referrals came from unexpected sources: doctors who'd exhausted medical options, therapists dealing with clients in spiritual crisis, even other priests who'd encountered situations that required more than conventional pastoral care. Marcus's house had become an unofficial pilgrimage site for those who needed tangible evidence that supernatural intervention wasn't just ancient history, but continued reality for those willing to open their hearts to possibilities beyond rational explanation. "Any word from Angela?" Mrs. Patterson asked, checking the oven temperature with the authority of someone who'd been supervising Sunday dinners in this kitchen for decades. "She'll be here at 1:30 with Vincent," Marcus replied, still amazed by the cordial relationship he'd developed with his ex-wife and her new boyfriend. The spiritual transformation that had saved his soul had also opened doors to healing relationships he'd thought were permanently damaged by years of emotional distance and prideful stubbornness. Angela had been skeptical at first when Marcus tried to explain the supernatural events that had changed his life, but she couldn't argue with the evidence of transformation she witnessed: his newfound patience with their daughter, his willingness to admit past mistakes, his genuine interest in other people's well-being rather than just his own professional success. She'd begun attending their Sunday gatherings, not because she believed in miraculous statues, but because she recognized authentic change when she saw it. Lily arrived precisely at noon, as punctual as her grandmother had been, and carrying a bouquet of white roses that matched the ones in Mrs. Patterson's garden. At 23, she'd inherited more than her grandmother's flowers. She'd also developed her gift for creating family gatherings that felt like celebrations rather than obligations, for making everyone feel welcome, regardless of their religious background or level of belief. "How are the plans coming for the church project?" she asked, kissing Marcus's cheek while arranging flowers in the crystal vase that had been his mother's wedding gift 40 years ago. Marcus smiled, thinking of the architectural project that had consumed his attention for the past month. The commission had come through Father Stevens, who'd convinced the parish council that hiring an architect with personal experience of divine intervention would bring special blessing to their construction project. "The new children's wing for St. Augustine's should break ground next spring," Marcus replied, spreading the preliminary drawings across the dining room table. "Father Stevens wants to include a meditation garden with a shrine to the Virgin Mary, designed specifically for parents who are praying for children with special needs." The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd once rejected religious architecture was now designing his most important building for the Catholic Church. But the irony felt like grace rather than contradiction, another example of how God could transform even the most stubborn materials into something beautiful and useful when divine love was allowed to work without resistance. The project had become deeply personal for Marcus, who found himself incorporating elements that honored not just traditional Catholic architecture, but also the specific experience of his own family's spiritual journey. The meditation garden would include space for private prayer, areas where families could light candles for special intentions, and a central shrine designed to remind visitors that maternal love, both human and divine, never stopped working. For the salvation of those they cherished, Jonathan arrived at 1 o'clock, still slightly uncomfortable with the religious atmosphere, but no longer questioning Marcus's mental stability. The business partnership had not only survived Marcus's spiritual crisis, but had prospered in unexpected ways, as if honesty about what really mattered had somehow improved his ability to serve clients who were building homes rather than just houses. "The Richardson family loved your preliminary drawings for their new house," Jonathan reported, accepting a glass of wine while carefully avoiding direct eye contact with the Virgin Mary statue. "They said hiring an architect who understands the sacred dimension of family life was exactly what they'd been looking for. Apparently word is spreading that you design houses where families actually want to spend time together." The comment reflected a broader change in Marcus's approach to his profession. Where he'd once focused primarily on aesthetic innovation and cost efficiency, he now considered the spiritual and emotional needs of families who would live in the spaces he created. His designs began incorporating elements that encouraged gathering, contemplation, and the kind of daily rituals that strengthened family bonds across generations. His reputation in the architectural community had evolved as well. Colleagues who'd once valued his technical precision now sought his input on projects that required sensitivity to religious and cultural traditions. Marcus found himself consulting on church renovations, community centers for religious organizations, and residential projects where clients wanted homes that reflected their spiritual values rather than just contemporary design trends. As the afternoon progressed, the dining room filled with the kind of multi-generational conversation Marcus remembered from childhood. Stories told and retold with slight variations that honored both truth and the importance of family mythology. Advice offered and received with grace on both sides. Laughter that built bridges between past and future while acknowledging the sacred nature of ordinary moments. Angela arrived with Vincent precisely on schedule, the pediatric nurse fitting into the group with surprising ease, despite his initial nervousness about joining a gathering centered around supernatural experiences he wasn't sure he believed in. His comfort level improved dramatically when Mrs. Patterson discovered his Italian grandmother had owned a Virgin Mary statue identical to the one on the mantel, creating an immediate bond over shared cultural memories. Vincent's grandmother used to say that the Virgin Mary was particularly protective of children and families, Angela explained as they gathered around the dining room table. She kept fresh flowers in front of her statue every day for 60 years, right up until the week before she died. Father Stevens arrived with the young couple he'd mentioned, their faces showing the strain of 3 years of unsuccessful attempts to conceive combined with well-meaning advice from family members who didn't understand the depth of their longing. Marcus found himself telling his story with the same matter-of-fact tone he used to describe architectural techniques. Supernatural intervention was simply another tool in God's construction project, as reliable as any other building material, when properly understood and applied. Your mother's faith was extraordinary, the priest told the gathering as they shared dessert that Mrs. Patterson had insisted on providing. But what makes Marcus's story so powerful is that it proves divine love doesn't give up on anyone. No matter how far they've wandered or how stubbornly they've resisted coming home. It also demonstrates that our prayers for others have power we can't always see in this life. The young couple listened with growing hope as Marcus described his mother's decades-long prayer campaign, the supernatural events that had forced his return to faith, and the family reunion that had taken place across the boundary between life and death. By the end of the evening, they were holding hands with renewed determination, their faith strengthened by evidence that miracles weren't just historical events, but continuing possibilities for those who refused to give up hope. As evening fell, over Maple Street, Marcus stood on the front porch where his mother had waited for him to return from school, from college, from years of spiritual wandering that had nearly cost him everything that mattered. The house glowed with warm light and the sound of family conversation, exactly as it had during the best moments of his childhood, but now he understood the spiritual foundation that had made such moments possible. In his pocket, his mother's rosary beads rested quietly, no longer pulsing with supernatural energy, but carrying the gentle weight of prayers that had finally been answered. The silver crucifix she'd worn for 40 years hung around his neck, a daily reminder that love really could transcend death and work miracles in the lives of those willing to believe in possibilities beyond rational explanation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve others who needed evidence that God still moved in mysterious ways to rescue souls that seemed beyond redemption. The church project would require countless hours of detailed planning. His business would continue growing as word spread about his unique approach to sacred architecture, and the steady stream of visitors seeking spiritual encouragement would continue arriving at his door. But tonight, Marcus was simply grateful to be home, not just in the house where he'd been raised, but in the faith his mother had never stopped nurturing, even when it seemed her prayers were falling on deaf ears. The Virgin Mary statue watched over it all with the same patient love she'd shown for decades, her porcelain face serene with the knowledge that some victories take a lifetime to achieve, but last for eternity, blessing not just one generation, but all who come after.